I'm really pleased to say that I've been joined by Elizabeth Price, and together we're going to share a few thoughts about diaconal ministry, the ministry of deacons. And then we'll ask you to speak to one another about what we've said in groups of three. And then we'll share some more thoughts, this time about priestly and lay ministry. So Elizabeth, thank you for joining us. You're a deacon.
I am indeed one of a few. I was a reader for 7 years, so ordained ministry seemed quite a natural progression from that. But I always knew that I didn't want to be a parish priest. I didn't really want the added responsibilities and perhaps constraints of priestly ministry. For myself, I need the freedom to work outside of the church as well as within, in the community, what we call on the fringes, bringing the gospel to those who don't know Christ. And diaconal ministry fulfills that need for me perfectly. I don't really like the title distinctive deacon or even permanent deacon. I think distinctive sounds rather grand and permanent sounds as if you're stuck in one thing or one place. There's sort of not much movement in permanent. So I simply use the title of parish deacon. But I do think it's important when speaking about deacons to differentiate between transitional deacons who will be priested at the end of their first year of ordained ministry, and those like me who've chosen not to be priested and will therefore always be a deacon. And there's a misconception that diaconal ministry is something of a halfway house, a step above lay ministry, but a step below priestly ministry. And I don't think it's either of those. To me, it's a separate and complete ministry within itself. And if we look at the book of Acts, chapter 6, it tells us that 7 deacons were appointed to take care of the widows and orphans in Jerusalem, whilst the 12 disciples devoted their time to prayer and the ministry of the word. So before ever there were priests or bishops or archdeacons and everything else, there were deacons. It is the original servant ministry. And I really hope that watching this discussion will be useful to the LLMs out there among you, because I see part of my role as calling all God's people to servant ministry, building bridges between the church and the community and beyond, bringing the gospel to those on the margins, the poor, the homeless, the oppressed, and those who simply don't know Jesus.
And of course, those of us who are priests are definitely also deacons. So if you're a priest, this is, as it were, half of what you continue to be called to. Mm-hmm. My general feeling is that sometimes clergy end up spending too much of their time on the priestly, and that has some serious repercussions for the church, because if the priest is spending a very high degree of their time on what could be called the inward, the congregational development side of church ministry, the people of the church might end up following their lead and also have a faith that is inward looking. And the clergy themselves could very easily become stale.
I agree with you. I agree that all priests are deacons in principle, but not always in practice. And we're seeing on the screen what it says in the ordination service about diaconal ministry. And I would urge all of you to read those words regularly during your ministry. You won't remember them during your ordination service. There'll be so much else going on, but they are essential to your ministry, whatever form that ministry takes.
Do you want to read them to us, Elizabeth?
A deacon proclaims the gospel in word and deed as an agent of God's purposes of love. They are to serve the community in which they are set, bringing to the church the needs and hopes of all the people. They are to work with their fellow members in searching out the poor and weak, the sick and lonely, and those who are oppressed and powerless, reaching into the forgotten corners of the world that the love of God may be made visible.
Beautiful, thank you. Yeah. So a pattern there, a pattern for parish deacons like yourself, but at least half of the pattern for those who remain deacons and are also ordained as priests. And it seems to me that it's all about, or largely about, the external stuff. I guess that includes evangelism and weddings and funerals and social action and building an alliance in civil society for the common good. A lot of it's about what you could call foreign affairs, isn't it?
I think that's partly right, but it's not the full picture. I agree that diaconal ministry is often about what's external. For example, I work as a chaplain. I work in a hospital. I work as a day chaplain at Chelmsford Cathedral. And I work at Pleshy Retreat House as a chaplain to the guests there and on an annual basis to the ordinands when they're on their retreat. I've also worked for 6 months out in India as a school chaplain and in the Holy Land at an orphanage. So all that, yes, is external, but there's plenty of work within the church too. It's not all external.
Okay, so tell me something of what I've missed out then in diaconal ministry.
Well, I think there are several things. The first is that although the heart of diaconal service is outside gathered worship, it's really important that the deacon is seen within gathered worship. Otherwise, the external ministry, I feel, can become detached, something with a separate life of its own. So for myself, I like the balance of being part of a church family and assisting at services and preaching, but also having the freedom to do my pastoral and chaplaincy work in the community. Although I would stress that not all deacons are used in this way, it depends upon the tradition of each church. But there are 3 aspects to diaconal ministry. There's the pastoral, which is the external aspect, and there's the liturgical and catechetical or teaching aspects within the church. And I suppose if you break it down, the higher Anglo-Catholic churches would use a deacon mostly for the liturgical aspect, especially within a Eucharistic service. The more liberal churches would probably focus more on the teaching aspect, for instance, leading Lent or Advent courses and preparation classes for baptism, confirmation and marriage, whilst the more evangelical churches would probably lean more toward the outward-looking pastoral aspect. The role within the church is one way we are bringing to the church the needs and hopes of all the people, as it says in the ordinal, along with doing some really good listening. I use my listening skills when I'm out in the community and making, say, pastoral visits to those who can't get to church for some reason. And I report back to my incumbent and to the PCC with any particular needs for prayer or assistance. So I am doing what it says in the ordinal. I'm bringing to the church the needs and the hopes of all the people. And I know you've heard me refer to diaconal ministry in the past as being the butler in God's house. And I know that's funny, but that's how I really see my role, as serving my Lord by supporting the priest quietly, unobtrusively, but effectively, just like a butler should be. It's what our former Dean of Mission and Ministry, Roger Matthews, refers to as leading from the second chair. And I think that's a perfect description of diaconal ministry.
So liturgical, catechetical and pastoral, with a particular vocation to look outward, perhaps especially to those that are most often ignored. I think that's really helpful. Elizabeth, is there anything else that stands out for you as you look at the ordinal?
Well, I notice it says that deacons are to work with their fellow members in searching out the poor and the weak, the sick and the lonely, those who are oppressed and powerless. In other words, diaconal ministry is not a singular soul ministry, S-O-L-E, soul. Deacons are to call their fellow church members to servant ministry too. But that doesn't necessarily mean calling them all to be ordained as deacons. We can all be servant ministers without being ordained.
Yeah, though as a matter of fact, Elizabeth, I know you're really good at calling people to think seriously about formal diaconal ministry. But yes, I absolutely take your point that servant leadership is for all Christian leaders, not just for the ordained.
I mean, as you know, it's my passion, but mostly it's a matter of calling others to begin to look more outward and notice the needs of those beyond their own church community, especially, I think, the poor and the needy. Inward-looking churches are perhaps not very effective, and having more parish deacons might help combat that problem by what I call having more collars out there in the community, and so increasing the public visibility of the church. What do you think?
So we're going to get you to get into groups of 3 now. You've heard that diaconal ministry is external service, but with an important role within gathered church, catechetical and pastoral and liturgical. Yes, that's it. With an important role that's about calling others to that servant ministry. So what we'd like you to do is to spend 20 minutes talking to one another about how that diaconal ministry works in your life. Some of you are deacons, and if you're a curate, by definition, you are definitely a deacon. And some of you are LLMs, but as Elizabeth has been saying, it's really important that you also have a part in this servant and external or outward looking ministry. If in your group there's a first year curate, and I'm doing my best to arrange the group so that most groups have a first year curate in them, then their perspective is going to be particularly important. Because there may be some who want to do a bit of further thinking about whether God's call to them might be to be a parish deacon rather than to be priested. Who knows? God can call in the most unexpected ways. And then we'll get back together. We're not going to have a plenary to debrief on this, but it might be helpful to you to make a note in a journal or something like that of things that you want to reflect on a bit later.